Hey guys, welcome to class. Today we're going to be talking about the midpoint formula, which midpoint hopefully is sort of self-explanatory. We're going to be looking for, if we're given two endpoints, what point is in the middle of those two endpoints. Now, if you remember, we actually talked about this a little bit in one of our discussion questions. We talked about this idea of midpoint, and so some of those same ideas are going to come back into play here today. So let's look at a couple on a graph. If we're given the endpoints, -3, 2, and 5, 2, we can put those onto a graph. And if we're trying to find the middle of those 2 points, well, since it's a horizontal line, it's not that hard for us to just count over one, and another, and I can just keep counting over until I get to the middle. So I would say that the midpoint is 1, 2. Now, the first thing that I hope you sort of notice is that obviously because this is horizontal, my y coordinates have stayed the same the entire time, okay? Well, obviously it's on that same line of y equals 2. But let's talk about the x coordinates. Well, one option is I can count those over. But I want you to think for just a second, how could you get that number without having to count over? So maybe what you're remembering is that we can find the average of those points. Or in other words, we can add -3 plus 5, which is 2, and divide by 2 to get that x coordinate, which is 1. And we could do that as well with the y coordinates. It would just be 2 plus 2, which is 4, divided by 2 is 2. Let's go to another example where now we have a vertical line. So the first thing you'll notice is that our x coordinates are the same, and hopefully you can tell as well that for the midpoint, we know that the x coordinate in this one is going to need to be 0 as well to stay on that same line. And again, I can here count down one, up another, down another. And I can just keep going back and forth like this until I get to the middle point. And I can also see, that this distance here is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And this distance, I went up 6 to meet there at the middle. So the midpoint would be 0, 2. And again, when we're given a graph and it's a vertical line, that's not that hard to do, but we want a method that's going to work without having to count up or down because it won't always be that easy. So take a look at the y coordinates to see how you could figure out that too. Hopefully what you notice is, again, this is the average. So 8 plus -4, which is 4, divided by 2 is 2, which is the y coordinate of the midpoint there. So now let's take a look at a diagonal line. Okay, so again, I have these two endpoints, and I want to figure out where the middle of those endpoints are. Now, in this one, because the slope is 1, and it goes right through the diagonal, we can as well count here to get to the middle. But again, it won't always be that simple that we can count over the squares, and so we need another method. Well, to figure out the x coordinate, I need to add the x values and divide by 2. But I can't just call it x and x. Remember, I've got to label it x1, x2. Because it's addition, it does not matter what order you add them in. And to figure out the y coordinate, I need to add the y's and divide by 2. Because again, that's the average that we've talked about there as needing. So this would be 0 plus 6 divided by 2, and then 6 plus 0 divided by 2, and again, that addition, the order doesn't matter. So I have 6 over 2, comma 6 over 2, which means the midpoint, we can use a capital M for that, is 3, comma 3, and again, if you look, that is the point that we got in the middle. So why don't on this one you try our new formula and see if that gives you what the midpoint would be as you look at this graph. So I got the midpoint was 0, comma 1. Let's put that on our graph, 0, 1. All right, hopefully you can see that yes, in fact, that does look like the middle. So we're just taking the middle of the x values and then the middle, which is the average of the y values, and that creates the ordered pair that is the midpoint of that line segment. So as you look at the box on the next page of your notes, you'll notice here that it gives you the midpoint formula, which we actually already determined, and that picture looks pretty complicated, but basically what they're wanting you to see is to get the x coordinate, you are taking the average or finding the middle of the x values, and to find the y coordinate, you are taking the average or finding the middle of those two y coordinates. So in your homework, and as we do these problems, which you'll be finding midpoints this year and next year and the next year, okay, this is a common practice in geometry, is to find the midpoint of two line segments. Sometimes we see those endpoints on a graph, and sometimes we just get the two endpoints. But we can use our formula either way. So in this example 2, we don't see the graph, but we can still find the midpoint. So if it helps you, label this x1, y1, x2, y2. Again, it's just x and y of the first point, x and y of the second point. It doesn't matter which one's the first point and which one's the second point. So I add the x values and divide by 2, and then add the y values and divide by 2. And again, hopefully it's obvious to you because an ordered pair is x comma y. You have to deal with the x's first and then the y's. So this midpoint, which we label with capital M, would be -2, comma 1. And again, if we put this on a graph and plotted those endpoints, you would see very clearly that that's the midpoint. But if we don't have a graph, that's okay. We can still figure out the midpoint. All right, why don't you and your partner take just a minute to try 1 and 2. All right, so go ahead and check your answers with mine. On number 1, you should have gotten -1, comma 6. Notice again, because this is the midpoint, it is a point, it is an ordered pair, which means you have to put it in parentheses, just like we always give ordered pairs. On number 2, you'll notice that your x-coordinate is a fraction. That's fine. It can absolutely be a fraction. You can just leave it as a fraction. It's just -1/2, 1, and we know that our points could be a fraction. That's no problem at all. All right, we're going to skip example 3 and 4 because I think you've seen hopefully enough of those. And let's jump down to where we see the graph. So it's asking you for the midpoint of line segment EF. Now, this is a good example of one where, because we have the graph, by all means, if you want to count like this to figure out the midpoint, and you can say that the midpoint of that line segment is 3, -3, you can absolutely do that. The issue is, if it's not a horizontal line or a vertical line, then we really need our midpoint formula to find exactly where it is. So for example, let's say DE. Let's jump down to that one. Well, this is going to be a little bit harder to find the midpoint of just by counting. So for this one, I'm going to identify where D is, which D is at the ordered pair -4, 3. Make sure you list that carefully. And then E is at the ordered pair 3, 0. And then I can use my formula, -4 plus 3 divided by 2, 3 plus 0 divided by 2, which is -1/2, 3/2. And so we can leave it just like that for our midpoint. Or we could write it as -0.5 or -5/10, and then 1 5/10. But if we look at the graph and go -1/2, 1 1/2, hopefully you see there that, yeah, that does in fact look like the midpoint, but it's much easier and more precise to find that midpoint using the formula in that case than just by counting. So when you're given a graph, you really can go either way depending on what kind of line it is that you are dealing with. Going back to number 1, line segment EF, if you had wanted to say E was at the point 3, 0 and F was at the point 3, -6, and used your formula to say 3 plus 3/2 and then 0 plus -6/2, you would get 6/2 and then -6/2, which is the point 3, -3. So again, hopefully it's obvious. You get the same point whether you count it or use the formula. So if you can count it, count it. But you need to know the formula because counting it will not always work. All right, hopefully that helps you understand midpoint a little bit better.